Hello, everyone. This is the 139th episode of the Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog. Unfortunately, Mr. Paul Whittle from the 1888 letter blog could not make it this time. For this episode, I interview English author Mr. Gareth Dace, discussing his book, Is Gascoigne Gonna Have a Crack? Spurs in the 90s, Magic, Mayhem, and Mediocrity. This book covers Tottenham Hotspur's decade of the 1990s. Mr. Dace is a lifelong Tottenham Hotspur fan who has witnessed this decade as a fan of the club. Welcome, Gareth.
Hi, Sean. Thanks very much for having me on.
Thank you. So, can you introduce yourself and your trajectory into football?
My name's Gareth Dace. Writing is very much a hobby of mine. This is my first book. It's not the day job. I know you've spoken to many illustrious authors before where their backgrounds are in journalism or in writing. It's not mine. I've always been a keen writer, but no more than that. My introduction to football was, I guess, like many kids growing up, my dad was into football, so football was always around me. Growing up at school, we got to a point where we'd stop playing, Pirates or whatever you played in the playground, and suddenly people were starting to talk about football and wore football shirts, and that was my introduction. And from the age of about 7, I was completely hooked. I would say my first thing I can remember watching on television it wasn't actually a Spurs memory. It was Euro 1988 when the famous Dutch team beat the Soviet Union in the final, and that Van Basten goal. And I can remember I was playing in the garden. I was doing something in the back garden at home. I can remember my dad calling me in and telling me I've got to see this goal that Van Basten has scored, that volley. And that was summer '88. I got a Panini sticker album, I think, shortly afterwards, and knew that Spurs was my dad's team, and knew that where I grew up there was quite a few Spurs teams, and they therefore became my team from that point forward.
What prompted you to write about Tottenham during this decade?
Okay, so the 90s. So as the 80s ticked into the 90s, I was just turning 9 years old. So obviously by the end of the 90s, as we go into the millennium, I'm a teenager, about to in work, having left school. So these were very much my formative years. So I think a lot of my personal development can be seen through the prism of supporting Spurs in the 90s. But I think I was just felt it was a story that needed telling. I think I hear lots of Spurs podcasts. You hear lots of Spurs people nowadays often referencing the 90s. And I thought, well, this is my era. So I want to be able to tell the story about what happened to Spurs in the era. And you read the title of the book, and that subline being about the magic, mayhem, and mediocrity. But I think to talk to many Spurs fans that were around in the 90s, it's that latter, it's the mediocrity that really resonates with people. And I think I started writing the book thinking I was writing at a period of pure mediocrity. But I think it soon became clear from memory that, I mean, the mind can play a few tricks on you. And, undoubtedly Spurs did become mediocre during the 90s, and which is why I think it's a story worth telling. But there was also moments of magic, and you held the cover of the book up there, but there's 3 players covered on that book cover there: Paul Gascoigne, David Ginola, and Jurgen Klinsmann, and they were far from mediocre. So we had some real magic, and we had some really fantastic moments, and some brilliant players who played for us in the 90s. So I wanted to project that story. I wanted to look at that relationship between the magic, the mayhem, and the mediocrity.
Apart having witnessed it and lived it, what was your process in researching for this book, the duration, and did you manage to interview any of the protagonists?
Yeah, no, I did. So I was able to speak with Jerry Francis, who was one of the Spurs managers of the 90s. So Jerry took over in 1994 and then left in 1997. It was incredible talking to him. I was also able to speak with David Howells, who was one of the longest serving players of the era. He was already in the first team in 1990 and was with us through until 98. I was also able to speak to several fairly prominent broadcasters and podcasters who cover Spurs. So that was an interesting part of the research piece. Judy Welsh, who wrote the foreword for me, she is the writer of the biography of Tottenham Hotspur. She's a screenwriter and an esteemed journalist in her own right as well. And she was really able to add some context to it. So the contributors really helped. I'd say mostly I was able to do it largely off memory because it was an era that I'd lived through myself, and Tottenham played such a huge part in my life growing up that I mean, even now, if you give me a date, I can largely tell you the nearest Spurs game to it without looking it up. And invariably, I can remember where I was, which some of the times was actually at the game, and I can remember the goals or remember who would have played. But sometimes I can remember, I was sitting around with parents' dining room table listening to that on the radio, and I can remember the emotion of hearing that Gordon Jury had scored a winner at Coventry. So I was able to do a lot of research off my off my own memory. But there's a lot of footage that's available on YouTube. There's a lot of books that I had bought that I'd probably read initially and given away years ago and repurchased, that I was able to just to piece things together as well.
Let's get into this decade. What was the status of Tottenham in the English football landscape as we start the decade of the 1990s?
Just to take you back a little bit further, in the 80s, Spurs were, I guess, unofficially part of what was known as the Big Five. So the Big Five were Liverpool, Manchester United, Arsenal, Tottenham, and Everton. And that was really based on their status and the power that their respective chairmen had in really governing the way that the game was going. So Irving Scholar was Tottenham's chairman from 1983. I think unbeknown to anyone really at the time, at the start of the 90s, although the Spurs team was doing quite well, and we had some where we had two absolutely world-class players in Gascoigne and Lineker, and we had some other really, really good players. So the team was in a pretty good shape, and it was developing as well. But really unbeknown to anyone, behind the scenes, there was absolute turmoil. So there was a huge rift in the boardroom between Irving Scholar and another one of the directors called Paul Bobroff. And the financial state of the club was absolutely perilous. So they were racking up huge amounts of debt, largely through the rebuild of the East Stand. In 1983, the club had become the first in the country to become listed on the public stock exchange. And part of their strategy as a PLC was to purchase and to buy other companies, which included Hummel, who were the kit manufacturers. Now, the idea of that was a good one. It was quite sound. It was that you would buy other companies, they would make money, and that money would then be invested into the football team. The problem with that principle was as soon as those subsidiaries stopped making money and started making losses, which was happening towards the back end of the 80s. So the club was starting to become riddled with this debt that its subsidiaries were generating. I think the warning signs came in 1989 when Lineker was signed for a real bargain fee of just over £1 million. But literally a week later, Chris Waddle, who was probably our star performer at the time, was sold for nearly £5 million. As the early 90s progressed, these rifts in the boardroom were getting worse and worse. The debt was racking up. That was the position Spurs were in. So a point when football was starting to change. Okay, the Premier League didn't come in till 1992, but the wheels were in motion by this point. So a point when clubs like Manchester United and Arsenal were really able to put their foot on the accelerator and to really start speculating at that point. Spurs weren't able to do that. They really missed the boat, probably cost them for a generation. So yeah, you got this juxtaposition of what was happening on the pitch as to what was going on in the boardroom.
In the summer of 1990, it's the summer of Gascoigne Mania. Can you explain the importance of this and its significance in English culture?
For sure, yeah. So I think again, just to go back to the 80s, football was in a really bad way. So I think for anyone who remembers, the mid 80s, which be fair, I don't. I was only born in 81. So, but from people I've spoken to, football was absolutely rife with hooliganism in the 80s. There were several tragedies to do with hooliganism and to do with football safety. You had the Bradford fire in 1985. So football wasn't something that many people wanted to be associated with socially. A lot of people tell me that you just didn't want to admit to being a football fan in the 80s. You were associated with hooliganism. Then in 1990, the England national team took part in the World Cup in Italy, and I think most people probably assume they'd do what they'd done for most of the tournaments in the 80s and go there and get beaten and knocked out fairly early on. But England's star man that summer was Paul Gascoigne, who was a Spurs player, and he really captured the imaginations. He was, arguably the best player. Him and Roberto Baggio were arguably the standout players and performers in that tournament. But it was his tears when he was given the yellow card against West Germany in the semi-final, which England subsequently went on to lose on penalties, that I think really resonated with an audience. By the time England came home after losing so heroically in that semi-final, he was a national hero. So he was not only on all the back pages, but he was on the front pages as well. So he became this huge cultural figure in England that for a brief period, because he had his demons, which came out a little bit later, but he was a national superstar. I think so many people of that era became Spurs fans because of Gascoigne and to a lesser extent Lineker, who scored goals for England in that tournament. So I think it's a really important turning point. I think certainly television executives, I think other areas of the commercial world could suddenly see, because of 1990 and because of Gascoigne, that this might be the time to start associating ourselves with football. And that World Cup had huge positive knock-on effects for English football, and I think it certainly accelerated the rollout of the Premier League and all the commercial opportunities that arose off the back of that.
Terry Venables had been in charge of Tottenham for a few seasons at that point and had been able to entice Gary Lineker back into English football in 1989. So, how was he regarded by the Tottenham faithful at this point?
Terry Venables, it was a mixed past with Spurs fans, really, because he'd been a Spurs player in the 60s and he'd never really fulfilled the ambition that he should have shown as a youngster. He was part of our 1967 FA Cup winning team, but I think even by his own admission, the fans never really appreciated him and never really saw the best of him. But throughout the 70s and then into the 80s, he had become this really fantastic progressive coach. He'd done incredibly well at both Crystal Palace and QPR with limited budgets. And then he'd got a move to Barcelona in 1984. And this was a really big thing for an English coach to have been handpicked by Barcelona. And he went out there and he won the league title in the first year. But Venables, it was never just about the football. He was a larger than life character, incredibly charismatic, and he had lots of side hustles as well. So he was a real entrepreneur. He had various business side hustles. He'd even written books that had been converted into television shows. So his mind was always racing at 100 miles an hour. But he was this real marquee when he became Spurs manager in 87. He was this real marquee signing. So we talk about players being marquee signings, but he was a real superstar as far as coaches and managers were concerned. So he had this bit of glamour attached to him. I think it's fair to say that his first 12 months at Spurs didn't go very well. He inherited quite a poor team, and there were lots of good young players coming through who weren't quite ready. They'd lost Hoddle, lost Clive Allen, lost Richard Gough. So it took a while, but once he'd signed Gascoigne in 88 and we'd rallied at the end of that season, then, as you said, Lineker the following summer, we'd finished third, and we were playing some really good football, and it felt like it was a team on the up. And despite the fact that Venables hadn't particularly worked for him as a player, he did feel we didn't use this phrase at the time. This was something that didn't get coined until Harry Kane, but Venables was, I guess, one of our own at that time, and you felt in him that we had this really good progressive manager who was going to take us into the 90s. So I guess sort of Venables, Gascoigne and Lineker as a bit of a triumvirate were the big attractions to Spurs at the time.
Besides Gascoigne and Lineker, what was the backbone of the team that Venables had at his disposal in the beginning of this decade of the 90s?
Yeah, it was a really settled team. So 89-90 Spurs finished third, and this is a long time before Champions League and finishing in the top four meant anything. So, but to finish third was a bit of an achievement. So it was a young team. He had brought in a few really good young players and incorporated them into the first team. So David Howells and Vinny Samways have both come through our very, very successful youth teams of the mid 80s, and then Venables had inherited, I think, really good experienced players like Gary Mabbott, who was our captain, and Paul Allen, who was a box-to-box midfielder and provided some really great balance. Then you had Justin Edinburgh, we'd bought from 4th Division Southend the year before, who was beginning to establish himself as a first-choice left-back. And then you had couple of Wiley pros in there as well. So Pat Van Den Hauwe, who had won the league with Everton in 85 and 87, joined us. You know, Mitchell Thomas, who we'd signed from Luton, who could play either side as a fullback. Steve Sedgley we'd brought from Coventry. So I guess Lineker and Gascoigne were the two superstars. Mabbott and Paul Allen added something. And then, beyond that, it was a combination of youth team players that had come through and players from the lower divisions that really helped establish the team. In fact, in summer 1990, having finished third, we only signed two players that summer, one of which was Justin Edinburgh. It was a loan deal that was converted to a permanent deal. And we signed a young striker called John Hendry from Scotland for not a lot of money, who no one really would have heard about. You know, you look at that through a prism of today. If a team that finished third in the Premier League only signed two players, one from the fourth division and one an unheard of from Scotland, there'd be outcry. But at the time, I think actually it worked for Venables because he had this set and established team, and that team that had done so well in 89-90 continued into the start of 1991. The league campaign started really well. So Spurs teams notoriously started seasons really badly. But in 1990, we actually continued that form from the back end of the previous season. And Gascoigne, it was definitely the best 3 months we ever saw of him in a Spurs shirt. And we started the season unbeaten. And going into November, there were genuine hopes that it wouldn't be the FA Cup we'd win, it would actually be the league title that we could compete for.
This 1990-91 season would obviously be memorable as well as disappointing somewhat at the end because of what would happen to Gascoigne, which we'll get into. But as far as the league, the wheels came off in the second half of the season and eventually finished 10th. FA Cup was the saving grace of this season. Everyone remembers. First off, of course, you have to mention what has the title of your book, that famous Gascoigne free kick against Arsenal. Was this the first season that the semifinals were at Wembley, if I'm not mistaken? Yeah. There's that memorable moment. And of course, with that line, followed by the FA Cup, Tottenham were victorious, but obviously there's that whole Paul Gascoigne, Gary Charles foul that in a way derailed Gascoigne's career.
League season, we started really well. We were unbeaten for 10 games. It was Liverpool, Arsenal, and Tottenham were first, second, and third. We played Liverpool. It was it was a rare game that was televised at the time. It was on a Sunday afternoon against Liverpool, first weekend of November. And they did a number on us. They came to White Hart Lane and won 3-1. And our league form absolutely tanked after that. It wasn't until I'd researched this that I realised quite how much. So from being unbeaten for the first 10 games, we then only won 5 of the next 28. And it was only really that form that we'd had at the top that kept us ultimately in mid-table. I think if we'd had a bad start to the season, we would have been battling relegation. I think all focus really went on the FA Cup. And so the club's financial difficulties that we spoke about earlier on really came to the fore. So I think they started to be seen in the public domain. Terry Venables himself was going out and trying to find investors to come in and to put money into the club. So I don't think he was as present at training, and he was an excellent coach. So the players really relied on him. They always said that when he was there, he was the best coach that they ever worked with in terms of the preparation and the detail that he would go into around specific opponents. So you can see that whilst he's not at the training ground, that's when results in the league really started to dip. But I've got to say, with the FA Cup run, as glorious as it was in the end, a lot of it came down to luck. So if you look at Spurs' respective draws in that, round 3 away to Blackpool, round 4 at home to Oxford, round 5 at Portsmouth, and round 6 at home to Notts County. So these are all teams in the lower divisions, 2 of which were at home. And certainly for the Portsmouth game in particular, we really relied on Gascoigne to pull us through them. So he scored 2 goals at Portsmouth in the 5th round, a game we were losing 1-0 at half time on a very, very heavy pitch. And yeah, he scored both goals. It was just one of those Roy of the Rovers moments where he took the game by the scruff of the neck and scored both goals. So having got through those rounds, what happened? Liverpool had got knocked out by Everton. Manchester United had got knocked out. So they were the previous 2 winners of the competition. So we found ourselves in the semi-final against Arsenal, who were champions-elect at the time. As you said, it was the first time a semi-final was played at Wembley. That wasn't planned. It was just that these two huge North London clubs with huge followings were drawn out against each other for the first time. And I think when the FA looked at the neutral venues they could go to, well, traditionally they would have been Hillsborough, it would have been Villa Park in Birmingham or Old Trafford. And I think they decided probably wisely that it wasn't sensible to send 40, 50,000 fans from North London up in the same direction at the same time. There weren't any other stadiums in London that were big enough to host it. So they decided, against all previous precedents, that semi-final would take place at Wembley. It was a sellout. It was a Sunday midday kickoff. I think everyone expected Arsenal to win. As I said, they were the best team in the league at the time. They were champions elect. They were going for a second double, and Spurs were the underdogs. Gascoigne himself hadn't kicked a ball since we'd beaten Notts County, and he'd scored the winner in the 6th round. He hadn't played. He'd gone in for a double hernia operation, which usually would take about 2 months before you could get back on the pitch for. But he had defied science and medicine to get himself fit to play in that semi-final, and lined up at the start of the game. And it was just one of those games where everything that could have gone for Spurs did go for us. So David Howells, who I spoke to, said that Venables, it was he'd been on the training ground every day that week, as he hadn't for much of that season, and he'd come up with a very, very specific plan for how to play against Arsenal, which really helped, and it worked. But yeah, Gascoigne's free kick after 5 minutes. So I was a 10-year-old. I was watching it up on the television in my bedroom at the time, and he stepped up to take this free kick, which was the best part of 35 yards out. And the commentator, Barry Davis, who's very well known in these parts at that time, I think rhetorically asked as Gascoigne stepped up, is Gascoigne going to have a crack? Why would you from that distance against a goalkeeper like David Seaman? And he hit this incredible free kick that combined power and swerve and bend, and Seaman possibly could have done a little bit better with it. But let's not take anything away from that free kick. As Barry Davis goes on to say in his free kick, that is one of the finest free kicks that this stadium has ever seen. And he scored, and it set the tone for the game. So I think Arsenal were absolutely shell-shocked. Lineker then poked through a second one 5 minutes after that one. And having got that 2-goal lead, we had something to hold on to. We were really pinned back for large parts of that game. Didn't help that Arsenal scored just before half time, but no, we held on, and then Lineker scored a third one midway through the second half, and that was it. And it's, still to this day, I'm 43 years old now, but I've seen us get to a Champions League final, but that afternoon remains as my favourite one, my best and most memorable one as a Spurs fan. To beat Arsenal, our biggest rivals, in such circumstances, with such an incredible goal by Gascoigne to get through to an FA Cup final. It's the semi-final is almost more memorable than the final itself, which again wasn't short on its drama. Again, Gascoigne was right at the centre of that. He should have been sent off inside the first 60 seconds for an awful tackle on Gary Parker when he ended up putting his studs in Parker's chest. And then 15 minutes later, he committed this incredibly reckless foul on the edge of our own penalty area, which resulted in him rupturing his cruciate ligaments and scuppering his move to Lazio that was supposed to take place and was going to bail Spurs out of their financial problems. But we pulled through. So David Howells spoke to me at sort of quite great length about how the team really rallied around the fact that the talisman wasn't there, and they pulled it through. Paul Stewart, who scored our equaliser, and then in extra time, the winning goal came from an own goal. But we were the better team on the day against Forest. We played well that day without Gascoigne. And again, a seminal moment in the club's history. At this point in speaking, it's the last time we won the FA Cup, and it was a really big deal at the time.
There would be a shakeup in the offseason as Irving Scholar left, and the new president was Alan Sugar. In addition, Terry Venables became a chief executive, and Peter Shreves was appointed as manager. How were these changes looked upon at the time?
Yeah, so I think everyone was happy that Venables was going to be involved in the running of the club. I don't think anyone really appreciated that by doing that it was going to take him away from the training ground, and I know the players felt that as well. No one really knew anything about Alan Sugar. He's a celebrity now. He's been the host of The Apprentice over here, and he's quite regularly on TV, and he's a sort of a cultural figure. But no one knew unless you really studied the business pages, you didn't know much about him. But he was a self-made millionaire. He'd done incredibly well in business until that point, and the way it was sold to us was that Sugar and Venables were going to be this dream ticket. So they'd cleared out the club's debt. Sugar would concentrate on the business side of things, and Venables would concentrate on the football. But it didn't quite turn out like that. But at the time, I think everyone thought it was very positive.
So this final season of the old First Division, the 1991-92 season, Gascoigne is still on the books, but he's out injured the entire season as he's recuperating. The novelty was that Tottenham were back in Europe for the first time since Heysel, playing in a Cup Winners' Cup. In the league, it was a poor season as Tottenham finished 15th. The most notable signing was the Scottish striker Gordon Durie, who came from Chelsea. In the Cup Winners' Cup, Tottenham would advance until the quarterfinals, losing to Feyenoord. In terms of the domestic cups, they reached the semifinals of the League Cup, but overall, it can be looked upon as a disappointing season.
For sure, it was. I mean, certainly league form wise, it was much the same as the back end of the 1991 season. They were always floating around lower mid table. There was periods where possibly they were flirting with relegation. They probably already had enough points on the board. As you said, Gascoigne didn't play, having been injured. He was supposed to have signed for Lazio in summer 91, but the transfer was deferred subject to him regaining his fitness and passing a medical, which he did. So we didn't have him that whole season. But it was Lineker's goal. So it was Lineker's last season in English football, and he scored. It was more than 30 goals in all competitions. But I guess a bit like the last season, league form was subservient to how we did in the cups. The FA Cup was disappointing. We went out in the first hurdle to a very good Aston Villa side. The League Cup, we got to the semi-final and were beaten by Nottingham Forest in extra time. It was the return to Europe that was quite special. So English clubs had only been reinstated back in Europe the season before, and in a phased approach. So having won the FA Cup, Spurs went into the European Cup Winners' Cup, and that was where all the energy and effort went into. So they had a wonderful two-leg or white game at White Hart Lane against FC Porto in the November. They were playing in the shirt that I'm wearing in now, because the home teams used to change if there was a kit clash back then. And then we went out very, very narrowly and unfortunately to Feyenoord in the quarter-final. It was very, very little between us. As it turned out, it was a mistake between Tortvet and Paul Allen over in Rotterdam in the first leg that caused it, and we absolutely battered them in the second leg, but just couldn't score the goal. And I dare say, had we got through against Feyenoord, we may well have gone on all the way that year. But it was a very, very underwhelming league season.
We come to the start of a new era as we have the beginning of the Premier League for the 1992-93 season. As you mentioned, Lineker was gone. Paul Gascoigne went to Lazio. Paul Stewart went to Liverpool. The main signings for Tottenham that season were Southampton defender Neil Ruddock, the young Darren Anderton, who had impressed in the FA Cup with Portsmouth the previous season. Early in the season, Teddy Sheringham from Nottingham Forest, whose signing actually doomed the former team, and they were relegated at the end of the season. Very good signing for Tottenham. This season, the managing duo for Tottenham were Doug Livermore and Ray Clements. The team finished mid-table at 8th position. It was an average season. They reached the semifinals of the FA Cup, but this time they lost to Arsenal.
Yeah, it was, as you said, it was the first year of the Premier League. I don't think at the time a supporter would understand from what they saw purely on the pitch what the difference was, but there was certainly this razzmatazz about football at the time, and it was on Sky Sports. So for the first time, English football was only available to watch through subscription services. You had this whole new ball game. You will have covered it with Rob Fletcher, probably quite extensive details about the birth of the Premier League. From a Spurs perspective, there was a sort of a freshness about the team that year. It started really badly. It wasn't a good start to the season at all. But the players that you mentioned, say Anderton, Sheringham. We also had Nick Barmby, who's coming through now from our youth team and played at various England youth international levels as well. I always remember this season incredibly affectionately, actually. So, yeah, it was a slow start. But once we got into the turn of the year, once that combination of Anderton, Sheringham, and Barnby were put together, it was a glorious spring, actually, where we scored an incredible amount of goals. And Spurs were really, really good fun to watch. And there's one game that really stands out, which was a league game at home to Southampton. It was live on Sky Sports. And Spurs were 1-0 down, but scored 4 goals in just over 5 minutes. Sheringham scored a couple, Anderton scored one, and Barnby scored one. And you couldn't stop the three of them at the time. And it felt that this was a really young Spurs team that, Venables wasn't the manager, but he was far more involved than he had been the previous year. So Livermore and Clements were running the team, but Venables was regularly in the dugout with them. And you suspect from seeing the way that the team was playing, he was involved in training as well. Incredibly unfortunate to have got beaten by Arsenal in the semi-final that year. I think we were robbed a little bit. We were certainly the better team in it. We definitely should have had a penalty in the first half that wasn't given, and Arsenal scored through a set piece late in the second half. And I'm sure we would have gone on to win that final against Sheffield Wednesday as well, and perhaps that would have built a team. But as was often the case with Spurs, what you saw on the pitch and what was happening behind the scenes were two very different things.
Now, you mentioned Nick Barnby. I do remember at the time there seemed to be some buzz about him after he had participated in the Under 20 World Cup, I believe in Australia in
Mhm.
1993. How highly was he regarded at this point?
Yeah, well, he went straight into the first team. The way that he formed that front three with Anderton and Sheringham, they had a real natural chemistry between the three of them. So he'd come from, I think, from a Spurs perspective, probably not many fans had heard of him at the time. You've read his name in the programme or seen that he'd scored in the reserves. But yeah, other than that, I don't think we really knew what sort of player he was going to be. But he'd been introduced initially as a sub in the October time, and came on and kept scoring goals to a point where he started to get picked every week. The problem that we had was that in about March time, there was this FIFA tournament in, I think it was the one you're referencing in Australia, and it was mandatory that he was called up for that one. So Spurs had no say in being able to keep him over here. And he went over to Australia. So it took him out of the Spurs team. And he then aggravated a shin injury that he'd had. So we got him back towards the end of the season, but he definitely wasn't at the same level that he'd been at when he played there. And it took him over the summer to recover. But yeah, you had this real superstar. And I really hope I'm not jinxing things here at the moment. But at the point of we're talking, Mikey Moore started his first game for Spurs on Thursday night and was really impressed. And I mean, Mikey Moore's 17, Nick Barnby was 20, but I see some similarities in their sorts of profile and the sorts of impact that they have on the first team.
At the end of this season, we have the feud between Venables and Alan Sugar. Venables' removal led to a strike by some loyal players, such as Neil Ruddock, along with his wife. Can you walk us through this conflict and its effects on the club?
Just to rewind a couple of years, I said that Venables and Sugar were seen as this dream ticket in 1991. And they really didn't know each other before that, although they were both from the East End of London. They had no sort of history or no sort of friendship before that point. I think the cordial relationship between them lasted about the end of that initial press conference when they're holding a scarf together on the pitch. I think from that point on, the relationship was doomed. That they both completely underestimated him. I think Sugar thought that Venables was this football expert who would just get on with the football side of things and not interfere in the business. And Venables, likewise, I think just thought Sugar was going to be this generous benefactor who was just going to give him the money and let him get on with it and run not only the football club but the business side as well. Sugar definitely underestimated how popular Venables was amongst the supporter base, but also the following he had within the media and the press in England at the time. And Venables was regularly wining and dining Fleet Street's journalists and influential people. They fell out that first summer of 1991. You mentioned that Jury was a signing. Well, Sugar had to reassure the banks when he'd taken over that the club wouldn't spend any money whatsoever until they'd sold players, and made that very clear to Venables, and then was stunned when Venables rang Sugar, who was on holiday, to say that he'd agreed a deal for Gordon Jury for £2.5 million. And Sugar told him in no uncertain terms, we're not to sign him until we've sold players. And then he came back from holiday to find out Jury was there as a Spurs player and we hadn't sold anyone. So the writing was on the wall from day one. There had been arguments about which seats Sugar was entitled to in the director's box. It was a clash waiting to happen. Over the course of 2 years, the relationship turned incredibly sour. I think it reached an inevitability that they weren't going to be able to coexist together. And at the back end of this 92-93 season, which looked really, really promising on the pitch, Sugar sacked him. And there was absolute outrage amongst the fan base. Everyone, well, I say everyone, I think a significant majority of fans were behind Venables, and certainly people like me had no understanding of what was going on and sort of the business deals that were going on, and Venables was trying to put in. I think I'd have to say reluctantly in hindsight that Sugar probably had no choice but to sack him. But it went through you weren't just sacking a manager, you were effectively sacking your co-owner and chief executive. So throughout the summer of 1993, it was an incredibly unedifying episode that played out in the court. So Venables took Sugar to court and was initially reinstated. Then Sugar appealed it, and then the original decision was upheld, and Venables was sacked. And you had all these mobs of fans baying for Sugar's blood, and at the courtroom, and literally spitting and swearing at him and his wife as they walked in. The players took Venables' side, and Neil Ruddock in particular was a real fan and advocate of Venables, and his wife led a protest that took place outside Sugar's mansion. So there's pictures in the book of Sugar's then wife Sarah holding a sign that says "We want tea, not sugar," outside of Sugar's mansion. So yeah, it really played out badly, and the result of it was that Alan Sugar was public enemy number one, and he desperately needed a big PR move to try and placate the fans at the time.
Well, the PR move was to appoint former Tottenham hero, the Argentine Ozzy Ardiles, entice him back to the club to manage the club. But the season itself, 1993-94 season, would be an unstable and disappointing season as Tottenham were near relegation. I think they finished 15th again. But let's look at the transfers. You have Jason Dozal coming from Ipswich. Later, you have David Kerslake from Leeds, and former Tottenham player Mickey Hazard came from Swindon. Later on, you have Liverpool's Israeli striker Ronnie Rosenthal. As far as the players who left, you have the Spanish player Naim, who Venables had brought from Barcelona. He left. He went back to Spain, to Zaragoza. Pat Vanden Hauwe, Terry Fenwick, another Venables regular, left. Paul Allen joined Southampton. Gordon Dewar eventually joined Rangers. So it was an unstable season on and off the field with so many transfers. It turned out to be a disappointing season with the domestic cups as well. Ardiles, I imagine his hero status kind of saved him at the end of the season, perhaps.
I think so. Yeah, he's a club legend. I'm too young to remember him as a player, but really, Ozzy Ardiles stood for everything that Spurs should be around the elegance of the football, the swashbuckling style. But yeah, he was really behind the eight ball before he joined. He had this rift in the boardroom between Sugar and Venables. So you had a lot of players who were really alienated. Ruddock had left, he'd gone to Liverpool. But yeah, you had a lot of players who were very, very unhappy with the way that the club was being run. We started the season actually quite well that year. Teddy continued scoring goals, but then he got a really bad injury at Old Trafford in the October. And as it turned out, it didn't return till April. We just couldn't score any goals. There was all sorts of unwanted records. We went 7 consecutive losses at the start of 1994. There were lots of other injuries as well. He just couldn't get a settled team out. Confidence was obviously incredibly low. And so we really just avoided relegation at the end of it. It was tight. It came into May. We travelled to Oldham on the 5th of May in a game knowing that if we'd lost at Oldham, we probably would have gone down. But if we won, then it would have relegated Oldham. And as it turned out, it was one of our better performances of the year. So Teddy was back in the team by that time. It was Samways and Howells who scored our goals that evening, and that win kept us up.
We come to the 1994-95 season, a post-World Cup season that brought with it a number of new arrivals from overseas. You have the famous signing of Jurgen Klinsmann, the German striker, as well as Romanian stars from the World Cup like Ili Dumitrescu and George Popescu. As far as departures, you have Vinny Samways leaving Tottenham after so many years, joining Everton. This was a season where we all remember the press conference with Jurgen Klinsmann, the diving school, ha ha ha, then
Hmm.
actually diving in the first match against Sheffield Wednesday, I believe the
Yeah.
season opener. But Ardiles' tactics was having five forwards and hardly any midfielders. And
Hmm.
that was suicide in a league like Premier League. Eventually, that would lead to his sacking in November, and Jerry Francis would take over. And to his credit, he would stabilize the team, and Tottenham would have a much better season in the second half, and in the end, a seventh place position looked good given their start. In the FA Cup, they defeated Liverpool but were eliminated by Everton in the semifinals. But this season is famous for the impact made by Jurgen Klinsmann, who became one of the best overseas signing in English football at that time.
Hmm.
And let's mention that it was somewhat rare to have. This is pre-Bosman days. Foreign signings were not frequent.
Yeah, it was a revolutionary signing. It's one of those everyone remembers where they were when they heard that Jurgen Klinsmann had signed for Tottenham. I was at home and found out about it on teletext, which was a very primitive form of the internet. But I'm sure many of your listeners will remember teletext. But just a bit of context. Spurs had been charged by the FA in summer 1994 for financial irregularities. These were things that dated back to before Alan Sugar's time, and it was discovered that Spurs had made illegal payments to players, loans for houses, signing on fees. And the rather sort of draconian punishment thrown at Spurs was that they'd been docked 12 points for the coming season, banned from the FA Cup for a season, and given a fine as well. Now, Alan Sugar fought that, and this is probably, as I said, Alan Sugar isn't remembered particularly fondly as a Spurs chairman, but this 6 month period from fighting this ban and signing Jurgen Klinsmann was definitely his best. If ever there was a point when Spurs fans were going to be happy that Sugar was chairman, it was around now. So we started the season, having off the back of a near relegation, known we were starting the following season on minus 12 points, and then Jurgen Klinsmann signs, and it was incredibly revolutionary, not just for Spurs but for the Premier League as a whole. All of the best players in Europe went to play in Italy, in Spain, even in France or Germany before they'd come to England. So Klinsmann coming, I think, really opened the floodgates for all the really talented foreign players that would follow in the years that went by. But start of the season, it was a really exciting time to watch Spurs. So we played with these five forwards: Barmby, Anderton, Sheringham, who'd been that trio from a couple of years before. Dumitrescu, who we'd seen play and do well for Romania in the World Cup. And then Jurgen Klinsmann arrives, who's probably the most high-profile centre forward in world football at the time. And he was not only a wonderful player, but he was a really charming man as well. We definitely lived in an era of xenophobia and jingoism in England at the time, and Spurs signing a German centre forward didn't go down particularly well in all areas of society over here. But he really won them round in that first press conference when he made the joke about was there any diving schools in London, and then the famous celebration after scoring on his debut where he dives across the turf, and that's the image on the front cover of the book, that goal at Sheffield Wednesday. So supporting Spurs was very, very fun for the first few weeks of the season. So we were playing in these really high-scoring games, winning 4-3 at Sheffield Wednesday. There was a 6-3 League Cup tie at Watford. We won a game 3-1 at Ipswich at the start of the year. Now, I spoke to Alan Fisher, who's a fan who writes a very good Spurs blog, was at that game, and he wrote about just the movement off the ball and the pace and the tempo in that first half. He said it was unlike anything anyone had really seen probably since the 60s. It was 3-1 on the night. Anyone there said it could have been 10 or 11-1. That was how good Spurs were. But unfortunately, it was very short-lived. So teams worked out how you could get behind this Spurs team, and that by the fact there were always five players in front of the ball meant there were lots of gaps behind them. So they started to get exposed, and the football just wasn't sustainable enough. I don't think tactics were sophisticated enough at the time. I think, to be fair to Ozzy, he was trying to play football that you'd almost expect to see now. But at the time, there wasn't that same understanding or level of detail that went into, what forwards would do and the angles they would go to stop teams playing and, pressing from the front. So in many ways, Ozzy was a bit of a pioneer, and he achieved some real success in other parts of the world playing exactly the same brand of football afterwards. But I think English football wasn't quite ready for it at the time, and so ultimately he lost his job as a result of it, which everyone was incredibly upset for, because Ozzy was and continues to be a club legend. But yeah, Jerry Francis came in. His football was slightly more pragmatic at the time, but he found a formula to make these incredible attackers work with a better backbone. And it didn't take long for him to establish club records in terms of the amount of games gone without conceding
And we
goals.
should mention that Ili Dumitrescu was his first casualty,
Mm-hmm.
as he needed midfielders to
Yeah,
stabilize the team. And he was loaned out to Sevilla later in the season.
yeah, that's it. He was the sacrifice. So he was dropped out of the team. David Howells ultimately became the benefactor. We played with an additional central midfielder, and so that really stabilised the team. It was great football to watch throughout the rest of that season under Jerry. It was the FA Cup quarter-final winner at Anfield was really memorable. More for the fact that Klinsmann scored the winner in front of the Kop at the last minute, and Spurs had played so well that the Liverpool fans clapped the Spurs team off that at the end of the game. And then Spurs being Spurs, having got past Liverpool, we were then thumped by Everton, a game that we were expected to win in the semi-final.
Jurgen Klinsmann, after such a great season, he decided to go home to Bayern Munich, as he was desperate to win a league title in his career. And he felt that was his best opportunity for such a task. This did not go down well with Alan
Mm-hmm.
Sugar. And we have the famous statement where he threw Klinsmann's shirt and said he wouldn't even wash his car with it.
Yeah, I think Sugar felt really personally let down by the fact Klinsmann was going. So when he'd signed a 2-year deal the summer before, and within that contract there was a stipulation in there which Sugar, bizarrely, for someone who's so drawn to detail, hadn't realised that the contract stated that he could go and talk, he could leave after one season if a bid came in for him. Sugar thought that the contract stated he would go if Spurs were relegated, which of course they weren't. But yeah, it's very difficult if you're the German centre forward and possibly the national captain by that point. Um,
Yes.
yeah, he got a phone call from none other than Franz Beckenbauer, the Kaiser, who was president of Bayern Munich at the time, who told him that they wanted to sign him and they wanted him to be their centre forward, and it's going to be very difficult for him to turn that down. So of course he didn't. He said, "Look, I've got this clause in my contract that I can leave." And yeah, Sugar took it very badly. I think he was probably a lot of pride, and he was probably hurt by the fact that's clause had gone into the contract. I think the wider ramifications for that, though, were slightly deeper than that. That you mentioned that Dumitrescu had been sold after a or he'd left after a fairly unspectacular period. Popescu, who we'd signed as well, also activated a clause in his contract because Barcelona came in for him, so he was sold after one summer. And I think it really burned Sugar's fingers, and I think it led him to the wrong conclusion that foreign players were mercenaries and were coming here for the money and would scarper at the first opportunity. So I think as a result of that, he became very reluctant to sign other foreign players. So that summer, Dennis Bergkamp was on the market, who would probably have been a real classic Spurs player. I think there's a number of reasons why Spurs didn't sign him, but one of which was that Sugar thought this was just another foreign mercenary. He was going to come over here for a lot of money. He was going to take all of Arsenal's money. It was a bit of cosmetic marketing. He'd leave after a year and they'd be stuck in square one. And it took us a long time to recover for that. So our reticence to go and dip into European markets and to seek value there for technically gifted players really held us back as a club.
We come to the 1995-96 season. Now, before the season starts, there's the Intertoto Cup and that famous match against Köln with the 0-8 loss, with a future Newcastle manager, Alan Pardew, making one of his rare appearances for the club. And I believe weren't Tottenham warned for fielding a understrength team or something
Mm-hmm.
like that? But getting into the actual season, so Popescu's left, Klinsmann is left, and early in the season, Nick Barmby left to join Middlesbrough. I believe he mentioned he was homesick and because he was from that area. As far as the arrivals, we have the Queen's Park Rangers defender Clive Wilson. Chris Armstrong from Crystal Palace was signed to replace Klinsmann to partner Sheringham at top. Later in the season, you have Rule Fox offloaded by Newcastle. Andy Sinton also came from Sheffield Wednesday. As far as the league form, it was much like the previous season. Tottenham finished eighth position, didn't do too well in the domestic cups. It was another relatively average season.
I think if you look at it through the prism of where Spurs finished now, which is usually the top six, it was. I think at the time, you remember, it's only 2 years ago from that we'd been in a relegation battle. We'd done well. I think that 95-6 season is underappreciated in a way because you've got these huge losses of Klinsmann, Popescu, and Barnby, and they were definitely replaced by inferior players in each instance. But we had some really good results that year. So we beat Arsenal at home. We beat Manchester United 4-1 on New Year's Day. This was the Man United team that went on to win the double. The football was okay without being spectacular. We were fairly consistent for periods of the season. We were in and around the top six for most of the season. And with 15 minutes of the season to go on the final day, we were in a UEFA Cup spot. Unfortunately, we were away at Newcastle on the last day, who were chasing the title, and Arsenal were at home to Bolton, who'd already been relegated. And we were winning 1-0 and they were losing 1-0 at one point. And we were due to finish, I think, 15 minutes ago of the season, we were in fifth place. Newcastle equalised and then Arsenal scored twice against Bolton to turn it around, and we finished eighth. But I think it's slightly deceiving where we finished that season. I think I say the league table doesn't lie, but I think with very, very small margins, Spurs could well have ended up finishing fifth that year and getting into Europe. But yeah, the season before 94-95 was so memorable, and it was so much fun that 95-96 did feel like it was a significant downturn at the time.
We come to the 1996-97 season, the first Bosman year. There's a lot of excitement post 1996 Euros hosted by England. As far as new signings, you have a Danish midfielder, Alan Nilsson, coming from Brøndby. Later, you have Norwegian striker Stefan Iversen from Rosenborg and Liverpool defender John Scales. And later, you have Swiss defender Ramon Vega arriving from Cagliari. Not many significant departures. However, this would be another average season for Tottenham, and they would finish 10th place. And again, they would leave the domestic cups early. In fact, they lost to Manchester United in the first round of the FA Cup, and they were heavily defeated by Bolton 6-1 in the League Cup. The signings certainly were not too exciting given that season where it seemed like all the teams were signing high marquee name players. Jerry Francis didn't seem to be able to push Tottenham to the next level.
No, that's definitely right. You said you had this huge fanfare around football that had been created by Euro 96 the summer beforehand. And yes, this season is I don't know whether you want to say it's the height or the nadir of mediocrity. But yeah, mediocrity is just festered the club that season. I mean, Jerry was very unfortunate with the number of injuries. So Chris Armstrong, who'd had a really good first season, got injured a couple of games into the season, never really recovered. Teddy got injured. Anderton was out the team more than he was in it. That FA Cup tie at Man United, that when we got beaten, we had two teenage strikers playing up front for us that day. We signed players like Everson and Scales, who then ended up getting injured as well. So it was a very, very unforgettable season. I think my biggest achievement in putting this book together was getting 6,000 words out of this season, actually.
Now we come to the 1997-98 season. As far as departures, Teddy Sheringham, Tottenham's main avenue for goals, he joins Manchester United, as well as the Israeli striker Ronnie Rosenthal, who joins Watford, and Jason Dozel goes back to Ipswich. As far as the arrivals, we have the Portuguese midfielder Jose Dominguez from Sporting, We have Norwegian goalkeeper Frode Grodas from Chelsea. Tottenham are able to sign Newcastle's exciting duo David Ginola, the Frenchman, as well as Les Ferdinand. Later in the season, Jurgen Klinsmann returns to Tottenham from Italian side Sampdoria. I believe him and Alan Sugar buried the hatchet, and Italian midfielder Nicola Berti arrived later, as did Algerian midfielder Moussa Saib. Jerry Francis would be sacked in November. Tottenham would sign Swiss manager Christian Gross, who was likened to Arsene Wenger, Gerard Houllier type of signing of a sophisticated foreign manager who will be able to take Tottenham to the modern era, but this did not work out. In that season, Tottenham finished in the 14th place with a negative goal difference. But the arrival of Klinsmann in the tail end of the season, he did contribute with a number of goals, but another disappointing season for Tottenham.
Yeah, it was an absolute car crash of the season. We talk about 96, 97 being the season that really was about the mediocrity. Well, this season was about the mayhem. Jerry started the season. I think he already knew that the game was up for him from talking to him. He wanted to resign earlier in the season. Sugar really liked Jerry Francis and convinced him to stay, but they decided between them in November that he would go. Again, the Christian Gross on it was one of many episodes where you understood what they were trying to do. The Spurs were trying. The idea was right, but the execution was dreadful. So Christian Gross was this unheard of Swiss manager. Sugar went out and met him and liked him or liked what he had to say and asked him or appointed him there and then. You had this farcical press conference where he's unveiled, and of course no one knows who Christian Gross is at the time, and he pulled out this tube ticket out of his top pocket and saying this was the ticket to his dreams. And Sugar sat next to him, cringed and realised from that point on that he was going to be dead meat. But I think the problem was that Spurs had this core of British players, and Gross was coming in and trying to introduce all these concepts that were on the continent were understood and were tried and tested and would become the norm in English football probably a decade afterwards. So things like fitness training and staying in a hotel the night before a game and thinking about the players' nutrition and what they ate. But unfortunately, I mean, David Howells told me that he was a very nice man, Christian Gross, but he had this slightly awkward and aloof personality, and his command of English wasn't good enough either. So he got under the players' skin quite early on, leading characters like Mabbutt and say Klinsmann, who joined not long after Gross did. And Mabbutt and Klinsmann were difficult players to upset. They themselves were quite nice men. So the fact that they fell out with Gross so early on really set the stall for what was to come. And we ended up battling relegation. And it took Klinsmann scoring 4 goals at Wimbledon at the start of May again to get us out of it. But there was a spell of that season where you really thought our writing was on the wall and that Spurs were going to go down that year.
We come to near the end of the decade, the 1998-99 season. As far as signings, again, not very exciting. We have the Dutch goalkeeper Hans Segers from Wolves, Rory Allen from Luton, the Italian midfielder Paolo Tramezzani from Piacenza. Later on, you have Maurizio Taricco, the Argentine from Ipswich, and German midfielder Stefan Freund from Dortmund. I guess a good decent side. You have Tim Sherwood kind of towards the tail end of the season, comes from Blackburn Rovers. Tottenham finishing in the 11th place. They did reach the semifinals of the FA Cup, losing to Newcastle. But the saving grace of the season was obviously the League Cup, where Tottenham won its first trophy since the 91 FA Cup by defeating Leicester in the final. And surprisingly, the Frenchman David Ginola would become the Players' Player of the Year. Christian Gross did not last the season, and he would be sacked in September. Surprisingly, former Arsenal manager George Graham was appointed, which I can't imagine excited any of the fans. But I imagine he was vindicated with the League Cup victory.
That's right. This is an incredibly dramatic season, and yeah, obviously encourage anyone to read the book to get the full detail of it. But yeah, the headline of it is that Christian Gross. It was bizarre. Well, I think everyone expected that he'd get the boot during that summer of '98, but he didn't. He started the season, and the season started absolutely abysmally. We started with a 3-1 defeat at Wimbledon, and then a 3-0 home defeat against Sheffield Wednesday. There were fan protests outside the stadium and inside the ground at the time. Gross's time was completely untenable. And then we mentioned Ozzy Ardiles signing, and Ardiles being this sort of PR stunt almost. Ozzy Ardiles stood for everything that was right about Tottenham in the club's DNA, the way that the club wanted to play. Well, on the very, very far end of that spectrum, if you think about the absolute antithesis of what Tottenham Hotspur stood for, was George Graham, who had won the league title with Arsenal. He had a track record of playing incredibly drab, defensive, dour, but ultimately successful football. And I think Spurs, as a fan base, we always took pride that no matter how badly our performances were, there was a commitment to playing attacking and stylish football. And George Graham, again, he was the absolute antithesis of that. But I guess what you did know about George Graham was that wherever he went, he got results. He got teams defending well. He got them. There was a sense of togetherness about all of George Graham's teams at Arsenal and to a lesser extent at Leeds. So we were absolutely desperate for success at the time. Arsenal had won the double in 1998, and it's still true today. I think the mood of Spurs fans about how we're doing is always, rightly or wrongly, it's always impacted by what they're doing down the road. So for them to have won the double and to have won it in such stylish way with these sort of really exciting attacking foreign players in the team really put a lot of pressure on Alan Sugar. And I think he felt this was his final roll of the dice in appointing George Graham. And I think, to be fair to George Graham, what we'd seen for the sort of the 2 or 3 years prior to him coming in was just absolutely drab nothing football from Spurs that was also yielding negative results as well. So him coming in, and he did turn things around instantly. The defense definitely was better. We were going into these sort of clutch cup games certainly in the League Cup, and we were getting good results from that. He was, I think, reluctantly using David Ginola, who was becoming the star of the team. So we had this League Cup run. So the FA Cup took us to the semi-final as well. There was a couple of results that year. We played again a very, very good Manchester United team in the League Cup and beat them 3-1. And then the week after that, they travelled down in the league and were 2-0 up, and we fought back. And it was this fight in Spurs that we hadn't seen for a couple of years, that we came back and we drew that game 2-2. So it was, bizarrely for George Graham, it was actually quite exciting. And we won the League Cup, and there was this moment where the fans didn't want to chant George Graham's name, but there was some recognition that he had offered something. So the song that went round Wembley after that 99 League Cup final, which was absolutely dreadful, by the way. I don't know whether you watched the game or have any memory of it. The best thing about Nilsson scoring the winner in stoppage time was that it denied us another 30 minutes of awful football from both teams, to be fair. But yeah, he was serenaded with the song, The Man in the Raincoats, Blue and White Army. We couldn't quite get around to singing his name, but there was some recognition that he'd won us a trophy. And I guess the thing with George Graham's football was, whilst we were winning games and winning a cup, it was bearable, it was palatable. But as we would find in the season that came after that, as soon as those results didn't start coming, there wasn't much to shout about in terms of the football, and all of his previous associations with Arsenal came to the fore, really.
Let's look at the decade as a whole. It was in general a decade of instability. Was it because of Alan Sugar's volatility, or were there other reasons?
I mean, Sugar is definitely the leading protagonist within the period. He's almost a constant throughout, having taken over the club in 1991. I think he probably had some half decent ideas, but what was the problem was, once Venables left, or once that distrust between Sugar and Venables really manifested itself, he didn't have anyone working with him who really understood football, who could give him proper advice and guidance. So yeah, a lot of the ideas that he had, there was some sense in them, but they were just executed really poorly. Yeah, I mean, volatility, I think, is exactly the right word. He would air his dirty washing in public. The Klinsmann interview being the classic example of that. I think it just brought unnecessary negative attention on the club. his reticence to sign foreign players and labelling them all Carlos Kickaballs really set the club back probably a decade. So his running of the club was a leading reason, I think, for the instability for sure. But I think as the subtitle of the book alludes to, it was a decade of magic, mayhem, and mediocrity. Yeah, it was a period. Spurs went from being one of the big five at the start of the 90s to being, at best a mid-table team who had very, very little influence on what was going on at the top table of English football at the time. But we did have these, absolute pantheon of Spurs greats. So from Gascoigne to Klinsmann to Ginola, you've got players who are still idolised now as cult and iconic heroes of the club.
Not to mention all those great kits.
Yeah, for sure. Including the one I'm wearing at the moment, the yellow kit. But yeah, some real iconic ones that sell very well. You see lots of people wearing them on match days now.
Even Samantha Fox, we have to mention.
How can you not mention Samantha Fox?
The main highlights of this decade, I believe, would either be the 1991 FA Cup or the Klinsmann displays during the 1994-95 season. What do most Tottenham fans cherish most from this decade?
Wow, good question. From a personal perspective, I think that 1991 FA Cup run and particularly the semi-final against Arsenal continues to be the highlight of my Spurs supporting lifetime. Yeah, I mean that Klinsmann season, I think it encapsulates what Spurs are about. Really, it's about being fun. It's about pushing the envelope. It's about to dare is to do is the club's motto. I mean, Spurs dared to do that year. The audacity of the signing of Klinsmann, the way that we tried to play football with him, and I think the journey is more important than the outcome. That's often the way that Spurs fans see football, and the reason that we support the clubs. And so the fact that that's such a memorable season, despite the fact that we didn't win anything, says a lot about the way that fans see the club.
If you had to think of a sliding doors moment that may have changed the club's trajectory, what can you think of?
For the better, Alan Sugar taking over in 1991. Had he not taken over, it's very likely the club would have been sold to Robert Maxwell, and that would have been absolutely disastrous if he had taken over the club in 1991. So I guess to that extent, we should be grateful that that Sugar actually did. I don't know, if there was any possible way that Sugar and Venables could have worked together in harmony, I think that would have been fantastic for the club. I think to have had Venables for a little bit longer and to seen through that project he'd started with the Sheringham, Anderton, Barnby, Ruddock team in '93 could have been really exciting. But I think a lot of the players that we signed throughout the back end, including Ginola, Ferdinand, they're all examples of players that we should have signed 2 or 3 years earlier. But yeah, I just wonder had that Klinsmann thing worked out slightly differently and Bergkamp signed in summer '95, it not only would have had a huge impact on Spurs, but of course it would have meant that Arsenal didn't go on to achieve the success that they did through him becoming such a big player for them towards the back end of the decade.
What's next on the pipeline for you in terms of writing?
For sure. Okay. Well, I'm pleased. I can almost give you a bit of an exclusive here for the Soccer Nostalgia, but I'm currently writing my second book, which is about Spurs in the 80s. So I think as someone who was born in 1981 and unfortunately doesn't have the first-hand direct memories of that great Spurs team of the early 80s, I was really keen to find out, well, how did Spurs go from that team to the financial mess that they became at the start of the 90s. So to really work on the prequel for this first book. So that book will be about towards the back end of 2025, again published by Pitch Publishing. So keep an eye out for that period. I was really keen to find out more about.
Well, yeah, that's the period I guess I became a football fan. So definitely something I would look forward to. In closing, what is the lasting legacy of this Tottenham's decade under Alan Sugar in the 90s in English football history?
For sure. Okay, so I mean, Tottenham's legacy, like not for the first and last time in the club's history, they failed to benefit from the opportunities that they had created. So I think the legacy is that Klinsmann was this first superstar signing from the continent coming into the Premier League. Whether he would have signed for another English club, I don't know, but he was the first. From a Spurs perspective, though, the 90s set us back probably a generation. It took the new owners, so Sugar sells up in 2001, and then Enoch and Daniel Levy take over, and it took them a long time to undo all the damage that had been done to the club, reputationally, and just the infrastructure that should have been put in place that wasn't put in place. And yeah, it took us a good 15, 20 years into the 21st century to catch up where we should have been. And that's probably the legacy that was left from the ownership of the club at the time.
With that, I would like to thank you for your participation in this interview. It was certainly a memorable decade for any football fan of that era. Our respective contact information and the link to Mr. Dace's book are on the blog and podcast uploads. So, Gareth, thank you once again and hope to continue these discussions on football history.
Absolutely, real pleasure. And thanks so much for inviting me on. I'm really glad that you read the book and had sufficient interest in it that you invited me on today. So thank
Yeah.
you very much.
Yeah, urge everyone to read this very informative book on this decade, and you really go in depth in analyzing this decade. So, thank you once again.
Pleasure. Thank you.